Yes. After the fiscal and euro crisis, the empire challenged. This is the Times, September 16th, 2008. Lehman collapse sends shockwave round world. Lehman Brothers Holding Incorporation was a global financial firm. Before declaring bankruptcy in 2008, Lehman was the fourth largest investment bank in the US, behind Goldman Sachs, Morgan Stanley and Merrill Lynch. Doing business in investment banking, equity and fixed income sales and trading, especially US Treasury securities, research, investment management, private equity and private banking. At 1:45 a.m., in the middle of the night, on September 15, 2008, the firm filed for bankruptcy protection following the massive exodus of most of its clients, drastic losses in its stock, and devaluation of its assets by credit rating agencies. Lehman's bankruptcy filing is the largest in US history. I think you might say that it was the biggest in the world globally, ever. And here is a picture from November 2010. The effect of this, of course, it was not only the Lehman Brothers collapse, but it was general events in September 2008. And a small green down here. This is estimate trillion US dollars. It was perhaps a half or a quarter of a trillion US dollars. Losses on loans and securities on those subprime loans by Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac companies. And then you have the red one. It's around $5 trillion cumulative loss of world GDP. So you see an extreme, much bigger effect on global GDP of this rather small loss. And then the blue one, decline in world stock market capitalization between September 2007 and October 2008. That is around between 25 and 30 trillion dollars. Why do I show this picture? Because it shows that now we live in a real globalized world. I mean, when such a small thing in the United States can have this effect on world GDP and that effect on world stock market, then of course that means that we live in a real globalized economic system. And practically all the predictions made by the sophisticated dynamic stochastic general equilibrium models proved to be wrong. In the autumn of 2008, the inflation rate in the European Union fell to 0, followed by deflation in 2009. The European Central Bank lowered its interest rate on its bank deposit facility in the euro system from 3.25 to 0.25 in July 2009. Today it's 0.05. And Swedish GDP fell with 5% 2009. The central bank lowered its interest rate from 4.75 to 0.25 in July 2009. The bank also provided favorable loans to the private banks. Central banks followed similar policies all over the world. Alan Greenspan, he confessed to, and I quote, a flaw in the model that I perceived as the critical functioning structure that defines how the world works. An honest man, he confessed that he was wrong. It wasn't as good as he thought. And you could say that old Keynes came back from his grave. Central bank leaders had to meet politicians in their governments in order to negotiate stimulus packages. Central bank independence was kept in the rhetoric, but in the reality, they had to cooperate. Politicians and central bankers had to construct those stimulus packages together. In theory, the central bank should act totally independent from the politicians, but in practice this system broke down. And who is this? The British Queen, whose personal fortune is estimated to have fallen £25 million in the 2008 credit crunch. She demanded to know why no one saw the financial crisis coming. And the Economy Prize winner from 2011, Thomas Sargent, he answered the Queen. They formed a group of economists trying to, what shall we answer the Queen? Every journalist all over the world asked them, what do you answer her? And he said, the criticism of the pre-crisis models is misdirected and reflects a misunderstanding of the purpose for which those models were devised. These models were designed to describe aggregate economic fluctuations during normal times, when markets can bring borrowers and lenders together in orderly ways, not during financial crises and market breakdowns. And you might think that I am unfair when I make this comparison, but I think you could perhaps compare him with an engineer who has constructed a bridge that collapsed in a storm. And he answers, but I constructed this bridge for normal weather. Here is what happened in north of Gothenburg a number of years ago, a bridge that collapsed. But that was not because of a storm, it was because of a big ship. Anyway. Well, in the United States, an economic stimulus package was prepared already by the Bush government, and it was enacted by the Congress and signed by President Barack Obama in February 2009. Its cost for the federal budget was estimated to $831 billion between 2009 and 2019. Here, Obama signs the package. The primary objective for the package was to save and create jobs. Other objectives were to provide temporary relief programs for those most affected by the recession and invest in infrastructure, education, health, and renewable energy. Also, an expansion of unemployment benefits and other welfare programs were included. The stimulus package led to a heated political debate between Republicans and Democrats, and to an even heated debate between Keynesians and monetarist economists. And my fellow economists perhaps doesn't like this, but I will show you a very funny debate in the New York Times. Here is Paul Krugman. He writes in regular chronicles in New York Times. And the 2nd of September 2009 he wrote, Lucas, that is, you know, this Robert Lucas, I quoted him earlier, economy prize winner and a sort of Milton Friedman type of economist. Lucas says that the Obama's administration stimulus plans are schlock economics, and his Chicago colleague John Cochran says they are based on discredited fairy tales. Their comments are the product of a dark age of macroeconomics in which hard-won knowledge has been forgotten. As I see it, the economics profession went astray because economists as a group mistook beauty clad in impressive-looking mathematics for truth. And John Cochran from Chicago, he answered 9 days later. Most of all, it's sad. Imagine this were a respected scientist turned popular writer who says most basically that everything everyone has done in his field since the mid-1960s is a complete waste of time. Instead, he calls for a return to the internal verities of a rather convoluted book written in the 1930s, that is Keynes' General Theory, as taught to our author in his undergraduate introductory courses. If a scientist, he might be a global warming skeptic, an AIDS HIV disbeliever, a stalwart that maybe continents don't move after all, or that smoking isn't that bad for you really. You can imagine 2 Nobel Prize winners in physics or medicine saying this sort of thing to each other. I think it's fair to say that this shows a deep crisis for the economics professions. That 2 Nobel Prize, or who is not the economy prize winner, Cochran, but this was the sort of tone in the debate in those times. So then we can say, or you can say, that who shall we trust? I will not answer you. I'm not so extremely sure myself. I don't think I agree totally with either of them. Also in the European Union, there was a need for a stimulus package at the same sort as in the United States. But the European Union budget, as you know, is just around 1.5% of total EU GDP compared to around 10% in the US federal budget. So the only thing the European Commission could do was to appeal to the member states to act. They don't have money enough to create a stimulus package for themselves. And to coordinate that was not so easy. The European banks were in a worse condition than even the US banks. European Central Bank and the member states rushed in to save them just as Federal Reserve and the US government saved their banks. But there were profound differences. The dollar remained a world currency. The dollar's share of global reserves was 62% in the end of 2009. So the Fed and the US Treasury could write blank checks, safe in the knowledge that it would harm the value of the dollar very little in the medium term. The euro was much weaker. The second difference is that the public debts in the European Monetary Union are separate. Banks are the responsibility of member states alone, whereas the US government and Fed are responsible for all banks, not the individual states. Or at least this was the situation in 2009. Now they have a sort of banking union on the way, but we'll see how it will go. Well, now, the euro crisis. This is the Economist. In October 2009, the socialist government of Greece announced that the country's true deficit was in excess of 12% of GDP and not 6.5 as projected by the former government. The former government was the New Democracy, a more right-wing party. The interest rates the Greek state had to pay to refinance its 300 billion euro debt, of which 75 was to French and 53 to German banks, went up. Germany's Angela Merkel, now I quote Varoufakis' book again. Germany's Angela Merkel said no to bailout to Greece, no to interest rate relief, and no to Greek default. After 5 agonizing months, the Greek state got deeper and deeper into insolvency. Here is Angela Merkel. In May 2010, the Troika, the European Monetary Union, the European Central Bank and the International Monetary Fund agreed to a 110 billion euro loan to Greece, but investors continued to bet on a default. A few days later, the EU created the European Financial Stability Facility with 750 billion euro. Its purpose was to borrow from solvent countries and lend to the rest. The European Central Bank decided between December 2011 and February 2012 to print around 1 trillion euros and lend this to the Eurozone's insolvent banks in exchange for worthless collateral. Less than 30% of them was then lent by the banks to the crisis member states. In August 2012, ECB announced that it would be prepared to buy and specified Italian and Spanish second-hand bonds in order to keep the interest rates paid by these two countries manageable. However, to get the German government with him, Draghi, also the ECB boss, also announced that these operations would be conditional on further austerity measures in the crisis states like Greece. But even so, the German representative in the European Central Bank, Jens Weidmann, he voted against. As a matter of fact, the ECB actions, you call this sort of action, quantitative easing is a technical term, to send out money in the system. It's a very controversial thing if they have a right to do that. If you read the European Union Constitution, the European Central Bank's role is to see to it that inflation is on a low, stable level. They have not the right to act like this, but they did it. And as often in the European Union system, when people do things, perhaps not outside the Constitution, it will be accepted because the crisis was so deep, so they could do it. And now I quote Varoufakis again. The Troika steadfastly imposed massive austerity on the deficit states, which worsens the recession and inflames the bankers' already grave debts, whether they will ever be paid back. And Krugman and many other leading economists agreed, but with growing right-wing populist parties in the richer European Monetary Union countries, politicians did not dare to spend more of their taxpayers' money to help the crisis countries in Southern Europe. I have had a very interesting Facebook discussion with some friends those last days, and especially after the Greek election. And as you might know, Varoufakis was sacked. He was sent into the negotiations with the Troika, but he made himself impossible. He was so angry and aggressive, saying to those stupids, don't you know, read Krugman, he can tell you those austerity measures will just send us down in a so low depression we can never pay back our loans. It's stupid. And I have written on Facebook to some of my friends who are very angry also on Tsipras and Syriza, the left party, the sister party of my party in Greece. And they say that he was a traitor when he organized this referendum in Greece, and the Greek people said no, but anyway he made this compromise. I think that if this referendum in Greek did not happen, I think the conditions would be even worse than they are. And I think the reason why Tsipras could win again is that the Greek people are so clever that they understand that he couldn't do anything else. I think that's, and Varoufakis, who is a very brilliant author, he is also a typical academic person. He lives in this academic world and thinks that why don't those politicians understand the economic facts? But I have been in the political system. I know that Merkel and Hollande and or the Finnish prime minister, they have their right-wing populist parties. They can't do what they would. I think that Merkel is wise enough to understand that perhaps it's not so good. I think that she would have liked to give Greece better conditions, but they can't because they are sort of prisoners in the situation where those right-wing populist parties are extremely aggressive and they can't be more. You might say that I am a cynical old politician, but that's my opinion. So I think I've also written to my left-wing friends on Facebook that it's your duty now to support Syriza and the Greek government and try to organize the collected workers' movement and leftist movement in Europe to form another sort of European Union. Not to just say that you have surrendered to. No. And I'm talking politics. I'm sorry. I am here as a sort of academic person. But you are free to think that I'm wrong. I hope you understand that. Well, the belief in the global economic system before September 2008 was strong. But during the following years, the system was challenged by some politicians in academia and by a number of social movements. And I will divide those challengers, or resistance, if you want to prefer that, in four broad categories. This is a little similar to when John Lönnroth in his fifth lecture described different sorts of ideologies or trends of thought. But I will call the first one post-Keynesian reformists trying to create a new Bretton Woods type of system. That is rather similar to what Johan Lönnroth called social democrats. Then you have anti-globalization activists trying to restore the sovereign welfare state. That has something to do what Johan Lönnroth called neo-mercantilists. Then you have sort of revolutionaries, this concept that I'm very skeptical to this concept, what it really means today. But anyway, they call themselves often revolutionaries, trying to crush in some way or the other the capitalist empire. And for the fourth category is reformists trying to create global democracy. And if I said I will be open with my own opinion, so I will tell you that the fourth variant is sort of my own. I belong to this sort of group myself. But I will try to describe the other ones in a fair way. And you can protest if you think that I'm unfair. First then, the post-Keynesian. And I'll take a little Swedish history. Excuse me if I know, for natural reasons, I know most about Sweden. In November 1994, we had a referendum on Swedish membership in the European Union. Our Prime Minister Ingvar Carlsson said that Sweden is too small and too open for Keynesian policies. But we can lift Keynesianism to the European level and create a so-called employment union. And the Swedish Social Democrats took up the idea in the Cannes summit in 1995. Transformed the European Union to an employment union. And the Amsterdam Treaty from 1997 had a paragraph that said that employment should be a common responsibility for the member state. And that was a new thing compared to the Maastricht Treaty, because the Maastricht Treaty only said that unemployment was outside the treaty. Now it's about inflation and so on. But I think it is fair to say that what Dr. Tittmeyer, a very impressive man of the German Bundesbank, he called it monetary solidarity. When we in the Swedish Committee for Finance visited him in February 1997 in Frankfurt, his thinking took over and dominated in the European Union until the crisis 2008. It was very funny for me. I was there together with the former finance minister Anne Wibble and the leading moderate right-wing politician Lars Tobisson and other persons. And they we listened to Dr. Tittmeyer. He had a sort of a preaching for us, silly Swedes. You have to forget your old, stupid ideas about expansionary fiscal policies and full employment. You must adapt yourselves to the new monetary solidarity to keep our currencies strong so we can form the common European monetary union. And I was the only one who tried to argue with him. And he laughed, like I felt like a little schoolboy. He said, "Oh yes, that's funny, I know your type. But you will have to think again. You don't understand this, little boy," sort of. Yeah. Well, anyway, I think this idea about the employment union, the reason why social democracy in Europe has had so big problems those last years to sort of find new is that this idea disappeared more or less. And now people like Varoufakis tries to come back to this. The post-Keynesians try to restore after the fiscal crisis. And I have a short paper in the literature list written by Nuno Ornelas Martins and others. And they say the European economy is trapped in a dark corner where the surplus is canalized into the balance sheets of commercial banks rather than to the real economy. This constitutes a liquidity trap. That's a typical Keynesian concept, liquidity trap. Means that lots of people have liquidity, but they don't use it. Real convergence of member states continues to be sacrificed to nominal convergence targets. We propose policies aiming at full employment in the European economy, a green economy, and a real convergence of regions and member states. This idea about a green economy also is an element in many post-Keynesians, that the idea to, because of climate change and so on, to invest massively in sort of green investments. That's also now an element of this sort of post-Keynesian thinking. These policies can be financed by the European Central Bank and by Eurobonds without imposing an additional burden on European taxpayers. And this idea with Eurobonds, that means that the monetary union is, as a matter of fact, transformed to a federal state, because if you issue bonds, you must have some sort of state behind you. So the reason why post-Keynesians have a problem to get sort of political legitimation is that the opinion in most European states is very anti-federalist. People want to keep their national states, and this means actually to give up very much of the national state power. And then I also quote Paul Krugman again. He wrote that a breakup of the euro is very nearly unthinkable. So the only way out is forward. To make the euro work, Europe needs to move much further towards a political union so that European nations start to function more like American states with a common federal fiscal policy. And also in the other regional continental organizations, you can see opposition to Washington consensus and move towards economic and political integration. I haven't got time to go through this in detail, but just to make some hints. The Community of Latin American and Caribbean States, with 33 member states, want to deepen Latin American integration and to reduce the domineering influence of the US on the internal affairs and economics of Latin America. So you could say that states like Brazil, Argentina, but even more so perhaps Venezuela, at least earlier under Chavez, but also Cuba is now a player in this game. Try to form a sort of similar to the European Union to oppose United States dominance. And here you have a map with the member states. And the African Union, with 54 members, want to, as they say, accelerate the political and social economic integration of the continent. And the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, with 10 members, has as one of many objectives to, quote, the integration of the ASEAN stock exchanges so as to compete with international exchanges. So you can see globally a sort of formation of continental organizations, to a certain extent building on a sort of post-Keynesian thinking, that we go together and form a sort of cooperation with free trade, but also with a common aim to create more employment, and some of them also talk very much about equality and small income differentials. And also, the established global economic institutions seem to change their attitudes and talk more of policies to reduce inequality and unemployment. And one example is this woman, International Monetary Fund's new boss, Christine Lagarde. She said in July this year, our findings, because IMF sent out a number of reports, our findings suggest that, contrary to conventional wisdom, the benefits of higher income are trickling up, not down. One possible explanation is that the rich spend a lower fraction of their incomes, which could reduce aggregate demand and undermine growth. So she criticizes this trickle-down sort of mechanisms and says that instead it's better to have more equality, because then people will consume and invest more. So therefore it's good. Equality is good for economic growth. And that is completely the opposite to what most economists said in the beginning of the 90s. And in August 2015, she said about Greece, Greece's debt has become unsustainable. Greece cannot restore debt sustainability solely through actions on its own. So we are a very paradox. IMF, who was known as a really hardline Washington consensus sort of institution, now acts as a sort of, what shall I call it, sort of supporting the left-wing positions in most over Europe and in Greece. And then we have Stiglitz, who was a former chief economist of the International Monetary Fund. He is more and more sort of acting as a post-Keynesian. We need Keynes International Clearing Union and transform the world trade. It's wrong. WTO, not the World Health. To a fair trade organization. And Varoufakis again, the persistent deficits and surpluses are like tectonic plates pushing against one another and threaten with earthquakes. He has a dramatic language. We need, and it's Varoufakis again, we need a grand coalition of emerging countries, Argentina, Brazil, China, India, Turkey, South Africa, planning investment and trade transfers between them. A second, even brighter scenario would be the West to embrace Keynes' suggestion of an international currency union. The prerequisite for this is that US policymakers grasp the meaning and irreversibility of their global Minotaur's demise. In Varoufakis' books, he compares the Minotaur with the United States eating up people going into the labyrinth, about this. And how he says the United States must understand that they can't hold up their Minotaur's role in the long run. And here I have a figure taken from International Monetary Fund World Economic Outlook from last October. It will soon come a new one, but I think, and here are the situation, global imbalances. And over with the plus figures, that is countries or groups of countries with surpluses, and the negative figures, that is countries with deficits. And you see, if you start with the deficit side, the biggest part is the blue one, United States. United States still is the big deficit country. And if you see EMA, that is emerging Asia, Hong Kong, Indonesia, Korea, Malaysia, Philippines, Singapore, Taiwan, Thailand. The biggest part of the surplus, that is the big surplus area. Now China is shaking, so it's a little uncertain. Perhaps that surplus will go down now. And that is a prognosis for 2016 to 18. So that's, of course, uncertain what will happen. But anyway, it's rather stable. The other big surplus area, it's the yellow one. That is DU plus Eurosur. That is Germany and other European advanced surplus economies like Austria, Denmark, Luxembourg, Netherlands, Sweden, and Switzerland. That is also surplus countries. And then you have here Japan has a deficit, but they have a big fiscal no, forget that. And also rest of the world have a deficit. And this post-Keynesian idea is to how to take this money up here and send it to down there, but not to the United States, not to the United States banks, but to the states needing, like Greece and deficits countries, and especially, of course, the developing world in Africa and Latin America needs surplus money to be transformed. And the last picture before we take a break. In the economic model of global competitive currency markets, geopolitical power relations are disregarded. Countries with current account surplus should have stronger currencies and lower interest rates than countries with deficits. But that is not so at all. This is this theory of relation between interest rates and currencies. But if you see, in spite of the fact that United States have those big deficits, they have a very low interest rate because people trust still the dollar in spite of those big deficits, while Brazil is the extreme example. They have to give 14.25% interest rate in order to get people to keep their money in Brazil and not send them to some other place. And then also you have Russia with 11% and India with 7%. And China 4%. In spite of the fact that China is so strong, they must have an interest rate much higher than in the United States. In spite of the fact that the Politburo of the Chinese Communist Party could, over one night, sell out their big dollar reserve and, for example, transform it into euro. So you could say that Obama government is a prisoner under the Communist Party of China's Politburo. But why don't they do it? Why don't they sell out the dollars? Just because China's big surplus is because of a rather strong dollar, so that China can compete and sell very much goods to the United States, because the Chinese currency, renminbi, which is now in those days devalued with 2%, it's in the interest of China to go on exporting to the United States, and a condition for that is a strong dollar, and a condition for the strong dollar is that China keeps a big part of its reserves in dollar. That's a very sort of paradox. Some people have called it the new sort of terror balance, a monetary terror balance in the world between China and the United States. Okay, shall we take a break?